Christians, real and clever Christians, are on both sides of the debate, so we're going to try and just sort of understand why there are these discussions. And then the second session, we'll be thinking about, we'll just be going back into a specific Bible passage and with our Trinitarian glasses on, seeing how that helps us to know God better and to relate to God better through being aware of these truths that we're thinking about. So just a reminder that what we've been doing is we've been going from the missions of God, what we see of God acting in the world, to the processions. What is God's own life like? That's kind of the question or the journey we've been trying to do. And I'm just going to read a bit from John 14 to help us see that we're all going to agree on what we see in the missions, really. When we look at John 14, we're going to see the Trinity in action, and the Trinity in action to draw us in and to have relationship with us. So notice that, and then later on we're going to come back to some of those verses to see why there's debates. So John 14, I'm going to start at verse 5. Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on you do know him and have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words I say to you I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it's the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they'll do even greater things than these. Because I am going to the Father, and I'll do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I'll do it. If you love me, keep my commands, and I'll ask the Father, and he'll give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him, because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. Before long the world will not see me anymore, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. On that day you'll realize that I'm in my Father, you're in me, and I'm in you. Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them." So just reading straight off the Bible passage, we're seeing that Jesus talking about the fact that he reveals the Father, he lives in the Father, there's a unity, and that when he sends the Spirit to live in us, that's how he and the Father are going to come and live in us. So we're seeing distinct persons and yet a profound unity are working together in order to get us to know God and to have God living in us, to have that relationship. So that's the kind of what we see in the missions bit. But then we go, well, why? What do we actually mean when we talk about God's own life? What people asked that question yesterday. What do we actually mean by being? What do we actually mean by person? And so I want us to think a little bit about the idea that humans are made in the image of God. We're made in the image, therefore, of the Trinity in some sense. And I want you to think, would it be better to think of God the Trinity as being like a human person, a single human person, who knows and loves himself, or like three human people who are united in love? So have a chat with the person next to you, 2 or 3 people next to you. Which is a better way of thinking about the Trinity, if humans are made in the image of God? Okay, I'm sure you could discuss this a lot more. I'm intrigued to know what you think. Anyone, put your hand up if you thought, thinking of God as Trinity, it's better thinking like a human individual with the sort of internal complexity of a human person. Anyone think that's a good way of thinking about the Trinity? How about people thinking that three people who are loving each other is a good way of thinking about the Trinity? Some. People are going, I just don't know, this is all really confusing. Yeah, that's fine as well. Good. Okay. So this is sort of a kind of debate that's been going on for a while, and it's just worth understanding that there's kind of two sides to the debate, and each side is driven by profoundly sort of God-honouring motivations, but we're going to have to think about how do we fit this together. So one side is sometimes called classical Trinitarian theology. Goes back at least to Augustine, but it's sort of been the mainstream for about 1,500 years in the West. And this says, well, actually, each individual human is made in the image of God. And the bit of us that's sort of most made in the image of God is not our body, but our kind of minds or our souls. And so it's in our minds, or in the complexity of the inner person, that we find the best picture for the Trinity. And Augustine, the one with his missions and processions, he very carefully tries to work this out. He says, a human being who knows himself, his knowledge of himself, if it's perfect knowledge, is almost like a second copy of himself. And it's active alongside the self who is knowing, as it were. And so, to use biblical language, knowing ourselves is like the Word. So he can appeal to the Bible, which says God always has his Word. Well, every person almost has their Word, their thinking, and if they're thinking about themselves, their knowing of themselves. And since God is spirit, he hasn't got a body, so his word of himself is actually everything that he is. It's a complete copy. And then you might say, well, who are you speaking your word to? If you're thinking about yourself, you're speaking your word to your spirit. Remember 1 Corinthians 2. Who knows the deep things of God but the Spirit of God? So Augustine says a single human person is actually a really good way of thinking about the Trinity. As you think about yourself, as you either speak yourself to yourself, who's listening to your thinking, or as you perhaps, another way of thinking about it is, he would say, as you love yourself, you see what you're like and you say, this is a being that's worthy of love. And for God, that's absolutely true. When he sees his representation of himself, the Word, he goes, yeah, that is good. I will that. I want that. And so Augustine would say the Holy Spirit is the bond of love, or the love of God. And so he's got a biblical basis. The Bible talks about God having his Word and his Spirit. He thinks that the individual human person is the best picture. And as he's doing that, he's going to have to say, in lots of ways, God's not like that. All our pictures are imperfect, and Augustine will go in great detail about saying how it's not quite like that. But he still says this is the best picture. If you want to read someone who's a relatively accessible modern book doing that, Peter Sanlon, Simply God, is a book trying to recover the classical Trinity. So that's one side of this debate. And it's worth knowing that for 1,500 years, this was the standard approach to thinking about the Trinity. And there were one or two exceptions in that period, but by and large, people have been going down this sort of route for 1,500 years, which is worth taking into account. But in the last 150 years, theologians have said, well, maybe the image of God isn't so much the individual. Maybe that individualism is actually slightly a problem. Maybe we should be thinking in terms of community. After all, in Genesis 1, it's humanity, male and female, who are made in the image of God. And so, to really see what the Trinity is like, maybe we see that when human beings who are different and yet working together in love, forming a community, that is the picture. Maybe it's husband and wife and child who are sort of, in a sense, the picture of the Trinity. Distinct persons who are yet profoundly united in love. And in fact, they become more distinct the more they're united. Husband and wife don't find their distinction by running away from each other as far as possible. The distinction of husband and wife comes in the closeness. And so for God, the divine persons find their identity in relationship and their distinction in perfect unity. God is love, and the highest form of love is love for another. So God must have one another love within his own life. That would be the argument. God reveals himself as Father and Son, and that's family language, interpersonal language. And so this is called social Trinitarianism. Mike Reeves, we recommended his book, I think, yesterday. Steve and I both basically learned our Trinitarian theology from Mike, so we both really appreciate him. He's a really good example of careful biblical social Trinitarianism. So you've got these two sides. One side which starts with what the individual, the one person, guarding the oneness of God, and then talks about internal complexity. The other which says we're going to start with community, and then we're going to have to really work hard to make sure that we come up with real unity at the end of that process. And both sides are concerned that the other side's getting it wrong. And they've got real concerns about the other side. So real Christians on both sides? Real concerns. So the people on the classical Trinity side say the social Trinitarians, you're actually in danger of making idols. You're trying to make God too understandable. And so they're really concerned about that. They think that the social Trinitarians have bought into some modern philosophy and tried to make God just too understandable. The social Trinitarians, on the other side, say, you classical Trinitarians have made a God who is too abstract, too far from the Bible, and that you have been taken in by Greek philosophy. You've got this God who is sort of all philosophical God rather than biblical God. So both sides have concerns about what's going on. Both sides are reading the same Bible and seeing the same things in the Bible, but it's how they're putting it together when it comes to the life of God that means that they have questions for each other. I'm not going to solve that now. I'm not even attempting to solve that now. What I want to do is just help you to see, there's a debate about what the life of God is like that flows from people who are reading the same Bible, seeing the same things in the missions, what God is like as he relates to us directly, and trying to think about what's God's own life like. And just to be aware that if you read Mike Reeves, he'll be very persuasive, but he's not the only side of this debate. There's godly people on both sides. So that's one of the sort of the ways in which, as we think about what are the three like, what are the persons like, there's some complexity when we try and think what God's own life is like. Or to think of another axis of debate, when we think about the three, should we focus more on the equality of the persons, they're each fully God, or on the order of the persons, the ways we distinguish them? Is it how they're alike, or is it how they're different that should be the focus? So if we focus more on the equality of the persons, we might say, since each person is equally divine, each person is equally divine. Each divine person gives themselves fully to and for the other two divine persons. So in the Bible, in salvation history, love is defined basically by the cross and by Pentecost. So God is love. How do you know God is love in 1 John 4? Because he gives his Son to save you. So God gives himself to save you for your good. That's the first thing of love. You sacrifice yourself for the good of others, or you give yourself for the good of others. But then there's also Pentecost. God is love. The second time it appears, it's linked to the Spirit. God gives himself to you so that you can relate to him. So perfect love is giving yourself for and to another. And that's what we might want to say, that's what God's life is like. Each divine person does that. They just pour out all that they are to each other, giving all that they are for the good of each other. And it's mutual. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit all do that. The Son gives all that he is, his life, his love, his wisdom, his goodness, his holiness, his power, to the Father and to the Spirit. And the Spirit does the same, and the Father does the same. You could definitely focus on the ways that they're mutually loving each other and totally equal. But you could also focus on the order of the persons. How are they distinct in the ways that they love? Each divine person must love in some way differently, otherwise you couldn't distinguish them. So the Father loves as the source. His love is gratuitous. It's purely a giving love, not a receiving or responding love. He's the source. The Spirit loves as recipient. As one who is loved by the Father and the Son, his love is a returning love. And the Son, you might say, loves as the mediator, the one who is both receiving from the Father and giving to the Spirit. So each person is fully love. You could focus on the equality, or you could focus on the order. How can you distinguish the divine persons in their own life? There must be some distinction. Otherwise, how can you know which one's which? How can you know that there are even three? Let me give another example of how this sort of equality or order comes out. Among the social Trinitarians, there's a guy called Zizioulas, John Zizioulas, who is an Eastern Orthodox theologian. Eastern Orthodox churches have bishops, priests, deacons. Zizioulas is really excited by the life of the Trinity, the social Trinity. He says that the way these persons interact is really great. And it's really important that there's an order in which the Father is first, because that justifies our church as having bishops, priests, and deacons. That comes from the Trinity. So we have an ordered church hierarchy because God is ordered. Another Eastern European guy, Miroslav Volf, I think Serbian theologian, he is a Congregationalist. He believes church governance should be very flat and equal. He's really excited by the fact that the Trinity should tell us what church life is like. He talks about the equality of the three divine persons and says, see, that shows us what church governance should be like. But do you see what's going on here? There's a danger that what we do is we push up to the Trinity and we focus in the Trinity on the things that we like about what we want to be doing on earth. Whatever we think is the best way to organise human society, we push that up to the Trinity or focus on that aspect of the Trinity and then say, see, God's like that, so we should be like that. So that's kind of this is another axis of debate. Do we focus on the equality? Do we focus on the order as we think about God's own life? One more axis, one more area of debate, and then we'll get you a chance to do some work. One of the big questions is how revelatory the incarnation is of God's own life. So everyone agrees, everyone who's a Christian theologian in this discussion agrees, Jesus reveals God in the flesh. Because we've all read John 1, and we know no one has ever seen the Father, but God the one and only who's at the Father's side has made him known. We've all read John 14. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But there's kind of a question. Is it that Jesus reveals God in the flesh? Or is it that Jesus reveals God in the flesh? Where do you put the emphasis in that sentence? Is it Jesus really reveals God in the flesh? So you maximize how you go from what does Jesus do on earth relating to the Father, and you say that's just what he's always done in eternity. That's just what the Son is like with the Father. And so you take John 14 verse 9 as being key. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Anyone who's seen Jesus in his humanity has seen the Father. The relationship we see between Jesus and the Father on earth simply is the relationship that he always has. So Jesus depends on his Father in prayer in his earthly life. And that's not just a human thing, that's a pointer to what the Son is always doing in his relationship with the Father. So it's driven by a very strong Jesus-centered approach to knowing God, a confidence in God's ability to make himself known through Jesus. But on the other hand, there are people who say, Jesus reveals God, but they keep wanting to say, in the flesh. Every time we see Jesus revealing God, it's Jesus revealing God in the flesh. Is God having become human. And that having become human makes a difference. After all, we don't say when Jesus is tired in the boat, that shows us that God got tired. There are things that we say, he does that because he's human. And those who keep wanting to emphasize this also want us to guard against breaking the great commandment against idolatry. That the danger that we make a God in our image and we reduce God to purely human understanding. So God remains beyond us. We're always going to have more to know of God. His infinite and eternal perfection is beyond human comprehension. And Jesus himself will say in his earthly life, the Father is greater than I. Chapter 4, John 14, verse 28, he says, the Father is greater than I. And we've just been saying in our Trinitarian theology, in God's own life, the Father and the Son are equal. They have the same being. There is no greater or lesser. But in his humanity, the Son says, the Father is greater than I. And so we can't actually always go straight through from the gospel, the way Jesus relates as a human being, and say that's exactly what the Son is like with the Father in God's own life. Because anyone who's following the Nicene Creed is not going to say, in God's own life, the Father is greater than the Son. We wanted to say the Son is equal to the Father. So it's true revelation when we look at Jesus, but it's revelation of God condescending to our level, God coming down to our level. Calvin will talk about the way that God almost babbles with us. He brings it down. It's like when you're talking with a 3-year-old and you simplify your language. When God speaks to us through Jesus, it's real revelation, but it's revelation brought down to our level. And there are things about God's own life that you can't simply read off Jesus. That's the argument. Okay, so I've given you 3 sort of areas of debate. Is Trinity more like one person with internal complexity or 3 people in loving unity? Is the Trinity, should we focus on equality or order? Should we focus on the fullness of the revelation that Jesus gives us? Or should we remember he's revealed God in humanity, and that comes with limitations, ways that we should be careful about how we go from Jesus to God's own life? Well, some people will just say, well, why? What? Yeah, maybe we just don't have to have this debate. Maybe we can have both sides. And so, thinking of the 3 and the 1, one early church theologian, one of the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, says, "No sooner do I conceive of the 1, than I'm illumined by the splendour of the 3. No sooner do I distinguish them, than I'm carried back to the 1." We just keep them connected. And maybe that's a good solution. That might be worth bearing in mind. That's a possible solution. That we need both sides of these debates, and we just keep going back and forth between the two, hold them in appropriate tension, maybe. But as we explore more deeply, many of us find ourselves landing on an approach that we think is biblical and faithful, and we're just ending up slightly one side or the other of these debates. And what I've done is I've put in a sort of diagram to show that you can sort of put the sliders at different points. You kind of, this is what the extra sheet is. You end up putting your sliders at slightly different points. No one is saying God is only 1. No one is saying God is only 3, but you might have a tendency to a bias one way or the other. Everyone agrees that there's both there's equality and there's an order, but where do you put the slider? Where do you tend to focus? Do you maximize incarnation as revelation? Even then, you're not going to say Jesus being tired shows us that God gets tired. Everyone agrees there's some limits to that. Even if you minimize incarnation as revelation, you're going to say this is still showing us that the one God is Father, Son, and Spirit. But we're going to make choices. Even within a single church, there might be people who put it together slightly differently. Certainly, among the range of Christian churches, there's different views. And it'll be a matter of, keep asking ourselves, have we taken the whole Bible into account? Or are we just picking our favourite verse that we like and ignoring other verses? Are we taking the whole Bible into account? And if I'm different to somebody else, is it that they haven't taken the whole Bible into account? Or is there something about, sometimes it's almost personality or church tradition that might be shaping why we're coming into things slightly differently. Let me just pause there before we get into the last debate for the morning. Any comments or questions on what we've seen so far? Anything that's you're just like, I just didn't understand that bit, or feel free to catch me in a break if you have time to formulate a question. We're going to go to one last debate. And this one is one that goes by the catchy title of Eternal Functional Subordination of the Son. And it usually there's 2 different acronyms that you might see if you read these sort of debates. One is Eternal Functional Subordination, EFS, and the other is Eternal Subordination of the Son, ESS. So if you come across this in writing, that will help you to know what this means. This debate really was a big debate about a decade ago, so if it just seems totally out of date, do tell me at the end, like, no one cares about this stuff anymore. But it may be that it's still sort of bubbling around in your minds, you're not sure what to think. So this is a debate about how do you think about God's life, in relation particularly to the questions of male and female. And so male headship in marriage and in church is something that's taught elsewhere. Ephesians 5 would be the classic place for marriage. 1 Timothy 2 and 3 would be the classic place for church. And the argument was that there's actually a parallel between particularly husband and wife and father and son. And the reason for thinking that is a passage in 1 Corinthians. So if you could turn, if you've got a Bible, to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. It's actually on your handout as well if you want to just use that. Sorry. So Paul says, I want you to realise that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So do you see the parallel that's being made here is husband-wife are paralleled by father-son. Father Christ, but we'll go with father-son for now. And the argument is that in both these sorts of parallels, these pairings, there's a quality of being, ontological equality is the fancy word for that, but they're worth the same. They're equally valuable. And there's a functional subordination. There's a leadership or headship role for the husband with the wife, and then for the father in relation to the son. So you're equal in value, but you have distinct roles, an ordered role. So the father is head of the son submits to or is subordinate to the father. If you just read the Gospels, you'll see that in terms of Jesus' earthly life, that is simply correct. Like, Jesus clearly is obeying the Father. Think of the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. But the argument is being made here that that's not just his earthly ministry, but his eternal divine life has this pattern to it. And if that's true of God, if there can be equality between Father and Son, they're equally God, equally valuable, equally worshipped, and an ordering, a distinct role, then that means that can also be true of earthly relationships. A husband and wife, equally valuable, mirroring God, and distinct roles. And people who made that argument, particularly probably influential, is Wayne Grudem, because his systematic theology is a bestseller. So Bruce Ware would be another theologian in the States who is particularly making this argument. But other evangelicals felt that this argument was a mistake, distorting our doctrine of God. It's important to say the people who were against this were not arguing against male-female, the sort of male headship. That's what makes this an important thing to be aware of. They may also be talking about there is a loving male headship in marriage, for example. But they're saying, but it was wrong to try and push that into the life of God. So they're not denying. We're not having a debate about what should church look like or what should marriage look like. The debate is, should we look at the Trinity as part of that discussion or not? And they said no. And the reason they said that is because you can't actually talk about subordination in the life of God if Father, Son, and Spirit are the one being of God. Because subordination or submission means one person wants something and the other person wants something different but does what the first person wants. You have to want two different things in order for there to be subordination or submission. But in God there's just one being, there's just one mind, there's just one will. They never disagree on anything. And so there's no conflict in God's life. There's no point at which the Son would say, I wanted something different to the Father, but I'll do what the Father wants. In God's own life, that just doesn't exist. There's one being of God. This is the argument that's being made. So this language of eternal functional subordination doesn't really make sense to the Trinity, or it seems to divide the Trinity in a way that isn't appropriate. They're totally going to agree that in the incarnation, when Jesus was human, he did want things that were different. He was hungry for bread, And so he was tempted to turn stones into bread, but he obeyed his father. He wanted two things at the same time, and so he had to choose which one. He obeyed his father. But that's not going to be true of God's own life. What I want to do, just to see whether any of this made sense to you really, is with the sort of the idea of the sliders, the scales where you can move the slider, I want you to think, the people who are arguing for eternal functional subordination, where would they put the sliders on these three scales? And the people who are against it, where would they put the sliders on these scales? So trying to say, it's a discussion about these sort of axes, these sort of options that is behind these questions. So see if this works. Well, let's see. There might be more than one configuration. It's not necessarily that there's only one configuration. Have a go at saying where do you think the two sides would put the sliders on 1, 3, mutuality, order, maximize incarnation as revelation, minimize incarnation as revelation. Yeah. Yes.
Just give him a minute, just because we want to do the photo this morning.
Oh yeah.
And then get to coffee. Is that right?
Oh yeah.
We can
pick up. Yeah.
Second session.
Yeah. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. Is it time to... Shall I interrupt now, or what's the... Yeah. And then you will continue discussions over break, yeah. Okay, so apparently we need to get ready to go for a photo. So you can continue these discussions over the break, and we'll catch up after the break. Steve, any instructions? Okay, should we make a start? We're just going to try and wrap up the last session, sing a song, and then we'll carry on straight into what this session would have been. We've almost finished. So we were trying to think, how would the two sides handle the sort of the three questions we were asking about, 1 or 3, mutuality or order, maximize how much the incarnation reveals the life of God versus minimize it. So let's start with the pro-EFS, the pro-eternal functional subordination of the Son side of the debate. What did you think, where would you put the slider for them for the 1 or the 3? Is it in the middle? Is it on the 1 side? Is it on the 3 side? 3 side? Everyone else agree with that? Yeah? Yeah, makes most sense to that. What about focus on mutuality, equality, or on order? The order side, yeah. It's not that they disagree with the equality, but they're putting a bit of more emphasis on the order side. And what about maximize incarnation as revelation versus minimize incarnation as revelation? Which side are they on for that? I think someone said it, but maximize? Yeah, definitely. They are reading off what Jesus is like in the Gospels and saying the way he interacts as a human with his Father is telling us something about God's eternal life. So they're going to definitely have the slide in that case on the left. Now, there's a number of different ways that you could oppose EFS, but let's just see what you thought. So, those who are against eternal functional subordination, while being absolutely committed to Trinity, absolutely committed to the Bible's teaching on headship. So, the disagreement is purely about this Trinity thing. Where would they be starting with the 1 or the 3? Most of them are starting with the 1. Yeah, they're more classical. Focus on equality or focus on order? More on the equality side. And then maximize incarnation as revelation or minimize incarnation as revelation. They're going to minimize it. They're going to say God is more different than you're reading off. Yes, Jesus as a human submits to the Father, but that's because he's human, and that's not going to be true in God's own life. So hopefully what we're seeing here is that these sort of debates, where you land on some of these things, sort of they work their way through, they're connected. And it's not straightforwardly a case of saying one is right and one is wrong. I think at its core, this particular debate is really about the incarnation question. It's really about how much does Jesus on earth show us what God's own life is like. Because Jesus talks about being sent by his Father. He talks about obeying his Father. He says, not my will, but yours be done. And if that is revealing what God's own life is like, then there must be some sense in which the Son is always following the Father. And the Father's always leading. So just a couple of verses. John 6, 38 to 57. I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me from heaven, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. I think that sending from heaven for me is what tips me onto I think there's something in EFS. I think we need to be careful in how we express it, because we don't want to divide the being of God. We don't want to make the eternal life of the Father and the Son have different wills, and then the Son has to submit. But he's sent by his Father. There's something appropriate about that. John 8:23 to 42, you are from below, I'm from above, you are of this world, I'm not of this world. If God were your Father, you would love me, for I have come here from God. I've not come on my own, God sent me. Again, that heavenly sending is where I think, there's something. We might need to express it more carefully than people have in the past expressed eternal functional subordination. I'm not quite sure what functional means in the context of God's eternal life. Doesn't seem terribly helpful, because what function do you have in that relationship? But anyway, my case here is not to try and persuade you of one side or other than that, just to show you how the debates are working, how godly Christians are having debates, and what things might be affecting the choices you make as you think about it. What we're going to do in the next session is go back into a Bible passage and sort of see how putting Trinity glasses on helps us to get a rich and helpful account of God that helps us to walk with God better. But for now, actually I think the right approach is to have a humility, to recognise we don't know everything about God. That even as we want to know more and more, there's still always going to be aspects of God that we don't fully understand. And so our next song comes from a New Testament verse which highlights that even in New Testament believers, there's aspects of God that are beyond us. He's immortal, invisible, God only wise. So let's stand and sing that.